Hi, everyone. My name is Milena Rodban, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to give this talk today. I'm a very long-time fan of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, and I've learned so much from all the amazing presentations that the Society has put on, and I'm tremendously happy to see interest in wargaming grow. Before we launch in here, just a quick disclaimer. Disclaimer that I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. Any opinions I express today are mine alone and do not represent the official position of any employers past or present. Any mistakes are, of course, my own. All the images in this presentation are mine, and icons are used under creative license from the Noun Project. Funny story, this weekend I happened to see the Dungeons and Dragons movie, Honor Among Thieves, and it gave me the idea to put a little side quest into the deck today. There are 5 images of what I believe are well-known board games in the presentation. And I will sort of hold the presentation for a minute on each of those slides. But for anyone who cares to venture a guess as to what they are, if you're able to identify all 5 correctly and email me before the end of the presentation, I will send you an invitation to the April happy hour. It's a monthly happy hour that I run all over DC. It's a great group of people, and we always love to have some new people join. So good luck. Remember to email by 8:05 p.m. tonight. All right. A little bit about me. I got my master's at Georgetown, big fan of the school, of course, and then went to work for a variety of different firms. Before starting a private practice doing interactive simulations customized to different organizations, everything from private companies to institutions of higher learning to NGOs and everything in between. And then I spent some time in the government as a senior advisor to the director of the National Risk Management Center at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, not CISA or CISA or half a dozen other pronunciations, but CISA. So we are all on a mission to get you guys to pronounce it correctly. Currently, I'm at the Krebs Samos group, but this talk was actually scheduled before I started my current role. So I will be speaking about my design methodology in past practices, not in my current role. Many of you probably know me from the geopolitics of whiskey talk that I give around DC. With an interactive tasting component. Most recently, I had the chance to do it in Boston a few weeks ago. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully, hint, Sebastian, we can try to arrange something for the Wargaming Society at some point. I think that would be a lot of fun. And just for fun, I threw in my favorite game, which happens to be Hannibal Rome versus Carthage. I have still never won in the many times I've played it, but I've come pretty close, and I'll keep playing until I win. So this is side quest slide number 1. I'll give you guys a minute to take a look and see if you can guess what it is. I love this game. I'm sure there are many fans on the Zoom today who probably love this game. So this one might be too easy, but we'll start off with an easy one. All right, moving on. So I have a 2-part title, geopolitical risk consultant and simulation designer, and I thought it might be useful to define the first part quickly. Political risk is generally defined as a negative change in an organization's business or security operating environment within a country, whereas geopolitical risk is across borders. I happen to think that those terms are insufficient, and that opinion comes from having spent a decade and a half in the field at this point. I prefer the term geopolitical flux because the emphasis there is on the change element. And in many ways, I think things that seem at first blush to be positive can sometimes have negative consequences and vice versa. And I think if we concern ourselves more with the element of change versus just focusing on negative things, we tend to have a much better understanding of how to navigate those environments. And the way I found to do that best is through the interactive simulations that I help design. Now, when you're talking about things like political risk issues, you think higher taxes, regulatory burdens, compliance requirements. When you're talking about geopolitical risk, it's more wars, cross-border issues, import-export restrictions, currency fluctuations, and arbitrage. So think of those kinds of issues and the ways that a lot of private firms, colleges and universities, NGOs, public firms, all of those are concerned with all of those different elements and how they can affect their business operations. And a lot of times, these are extremely complicated issues. They have many layers, they have many details, they evolve very quickly and over time. And a lot of organizations struggle to understand how they're going to affect their operations. They struggle to move out of a mostly reactive attitude towards these types of issues and into a more proactive attitude where you can actually do some of the scenario planning and simulation work ahead of time to better position yourself to succeed in these changing environments. So that defines the first part there. I am a big believer in experience. Experiential learning just to me is far superior than other types of learning. I myself, I have always been an experiential learner. I like tinkering and trying and experiencing instead of being told something. And I was lucky enough to go to a school that encouraged that. And I had the chance to take part in all kinds of the traditional extracurriculars that would attract someone who likes experiential learning, mock trial, theater. We even got to do staff rides to battlefields in high school, which is really a lot of fun. In college and in grad school, which I attended right after, I did all the classes that weren't traditional lectures. So I took, Model UN classes with simulations. I had a great military strategy course where some of my classmates built tanks out of large boxes. So we did it all, and I'm a huge believer in that type of learning. And I think that oftentimes when we leave the school environment, we stop learning that way. And I think that that's been a big drawback in the world of geopolitical risk, especially, but in the world at large as well, because many people learn by doing best. And so I've been sort of trying to live out this philosophy and then preach it to anybody who will listen. I'm a big fan of Wargaming Society friend, Dr. Pigeon Fielder's work. And I actually really enjoyed his talk for the society some months ago. That was a really great one. So back to sort of how I got into this, because I know a lot of people on these Zooms often wonder how to get into this career. My first job out of grad school, actually, I was working at a large consulting firm, and we had this gigantic watch floor. So think of NASA style, huge screens, everybody sitting in these semicircles. And there was a 24-hour watch floor. So analysts were covering every region of the globe, different areas of interest to clients. And although I was on the consulting side of this firm, I had the opportunity to create training simulations for the watch floor analysts. So a lot of times we would have situations where there were multiple events going on at the same time. You had huge global events, you had summits, you had something like Olympic Games. At that point in the dark days of the mid-2010s, technology was a bit different, and terror attacks were a seemingly frequent occurrence. And so we were constantly trying to figure out, how do we delegate our scarce resources on the watch floor to notifying clients, prioritizing what order they'd be notified in, figuring out who to tell about what. And so we would run these training simulations every so often. And I got to write the injects, the pieces of information that moved these simulations forward, and got to see that through these simulations, our watch floor analysts got much stronger, much more able to work together, much more able to prioritize. And I really saw an organization that was able to advance and improve through the use of sims. And so I was at that point, like I said, on the consulting side. Our deliverables, a word I hate, but nonetheless must use, were mostly reports, and we would slave over these reports. And then it was very clear to us that in a lot of cases, they were not read, easily ignored. They didn't change anyone's mind. They didn't help anyone better understand complicated geopolitical issues. They didn't help companies do a better job of preparing or managing crises when they occurred. And so after a few years of doing that, I decided I was going to go all in on simulations. And so I started designing for a variety of clients, like I said, everything from pondering a new market entry, helping universities understand how to manage travel abroad programs, again, during a time of periodic terror attacks, the need to notify your students, the need to keep track of your students. I even designed several simulations for capstone courses, so helping the senior class demonstrate to their professors what they had learned over the rest of their education. I helped large companies that were having crisis after crisis and poorly managing each, help them understand what was it that was going wrong, that was causing these repeated crises. Why weren't they learning from their mistakes? Why weren't they managing better? And this was an extremely fun time for me. I got to be endlessly creative. I got to do a lot of really interesting designs. I got to work with some really amazing subject matter experts who were the ones who did highly technical injects. I, of course, know a bit, but I could not possibly hope to simulate, infrastructure failure or how to do something that might read like either a technical fault or sabotage. And so I was working with subject matter experts who were able to create these highly realistic technical injects for these simulations. And after a while, I happened to notice that most of my clients were in the tech space. Tech was growing rapidly at that point and expanding globally, and there was a lot going on that these tech companies needed to be aware of, and they needed to anticipate and understand. But oftentimes highly technical people, especially in startup mode, they don't have the luxury of employing full-time geopolitical risk staff. And so they were able to contract with me, and I could help them, come in and teach them what they needed to know through this simulation framework. And thereby I sort of found my niche. Then COVID hit, and everybody was grounded for a while. So no more fancy trips to Silicon Valley. But at that point, I had a tremendous opportunity to join the National Risk Management Center and to apply that level of creativity and thinking to the response to the COVID national emergency, to understanding how the pandemic could evolve, how our response could evolve. We were running workshops, bringing in experts to consider some of the different possibilities for how things could go, how the vaccine rollout might work, how the world might look different after the pandemic, and a lot of the things that we sort of identified, the whole concept of the future of work and hybrid work environments and how to make all that work have come to pass. And so hopefully, I was able to contribute to a better understanding of some of those issues. And I got to work on some really great things with some really amazing people. And it was a fantastic opportunity to sort of round out my knowledge, since I have the private sector and a little bit of the academic and NGO perspective, and this added the government perspective to my expertise. So let's kind of dig into how it all works. To paraphrase a Prussian strategist, plans rarely survive contact with reality. A lot of times the best written plans are written by people with only very limited information. The people writing the plans are not also the people who will be enacting the plans oftentimes, or they'll be ones enacting only a small piece of the plan, and they know that part really well, but they don't know the rest. A plan might be wonderful, but it might fall apart completely at the first step if it hasn't been practiced and iterated on. One of my pet peeves, coincidentally, is when people compare geopolitics to playing chess. And one of the reasons that this drives me slightly crazy is in chess, you have perfect information. You see all the pieces, you see the full board, you know exactly where things can be, you know how they can move. You don't have the opportunity to go off board. A dragon can't swoop in onto the board. magic doesn't work, you can't spawn new pawns, and geopolitics might not have dragons, but there's certainly a lot you can't see, and you don't have perfect information in the least. And so helping people understand the complexity of the world that they're operating in, the vast size of the board on which they're playing, is really something that you can't, just down to something so simple. And I find that these customized simulations go much farther in helping people understand these concepts. So how do organizations increase their flux capacity, as I call it? Their ability to sort of anticipate changes to their operating environments, respond to them well, and manage crises, because obviously you can never practice your way out of ever being in a crisis, but you can sure as hell practice your way into managing crises much more intelligently. So let's take a second here for side quest slide number 2. This one might be a little harder, but hopefully some of you will get it. I bet Sebastian knows the answers to all of these. All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. All right. So why custom simulations? Why is this a thing that companies even buy? Why do they invest the time to do these? To some extent, compliance frameworks require that companies do 2 to 3 tabletops a year based around certain risk management practices, security practices, and the like. So to some extent, it's already baked in through compliance requirements. In other cases, companies are really interested to see how things are working or where things are not working. They're interested to see how employees might respond to an unexpected situation. They might want to bring a bunch of people into the room to make a complicated decision. They might want to identify places where additional training is needed, and they just simply don't know where the current shortcomings are. They might want to see where there's a lack of interoperability between teams who are doing things differently or who don't necessarily understand each other's work. For example, I had a situation once where a company had one team think that turning off a certain system to prevent damage to their network wouldn't have any other repercussions, but it turns out they basically completely disabled another team's ability to do their jobs. And until a situation had caused that specific cascade to occur, they weren't aware of that connection. So really making these kinds of things obvious or more obvious to people is one way to sort of identify these issues before they become a real problem in a crisis. It's also a way to explore certain potential opportunities, to think about how a large global crisis might unfold, to find a silver lining for that company's operations, or a way that that company can step in and fill a void. So if you think back to fire drills in school, for example, in the case of my school, our building was quite large, and we went through a series of different construction projects that expanded and changed the school's footprint and entrances and exits. So if you were just armed with an understanding of what the company looked like as a startup, or what the school looked like to begin with, and someone told you find the fastest way out, if you didn't have updated information, if you didn't have a clear understanding of the current state of the company or the school, you would have a much harder time of doing it, right? So we would practice our fire drills at different times of the day, in different circumstances, from different starting points, to see, could we get out of the building within the required amount of time? Were we running into traffic jams with a lot of other classes using the same exit at that time? Were we losing people through long hallways? Similarly to that, companies need to be constantly updating their knowledge of what their footprint looks like. And when you think about a traditional international company, their footprints are huge. They're in dozens of companies, they have hundreds and thousands of facilities, and the ability to sort of get a clear snapshot of where everybody is and what's working, what's not working, is really difficult to achieve unless you have an incredible information management system And you're doing these sorts of simulations to understand what happens if ... And in a lot of cases, you find that what you think was working perfectly, stressed a little bit more, things fall apart. All right. So broadly speaking, there are 3 types of simulations that I tend to design. There's some disagreement around what to call these. These are sorts of the terms I've settled on. Your mileage may vary. You might have a completely different idea of what they should be called. But broadly speaking, you have your training sims. These tend to be run repeatedly over and over again. They might be run at a company's headquarters and then at their major offices or at their branches. And these are really designed to practice something, practice a plan, or change a behavior. So they've seen that people aren't well trained in something and they want to train them to do something differently. You have your sort of analytical simulations. These are mostly built around making a concrete decision, anticipating some potential externalities, determining a point of failure if you're having repeated crises and you game out one that's built sort of on a chimera of your past crises and see where the things start to really break down. And you sort of have your exploratory simulations. These tend to be run once or twice, a few times maybe at most. These are sort of tackling very complicated questions, testing a plan, improving outcomes, really not built around a specific decision that you're trying to make immediately, but really trying to explore possible future states, possible ways that something might trend. Maybe you're deciding whether or not to go into a new market at all, whether you should be focusing on your domestic market. So these are much more of the sort of less tightly bound simulations. So training, super tightly bound, usually on the shorter side, few moving parts. And then exploratory on the other end of the spectrum, much more complicated, longer, more parts. Ideally, an organization would hold an analytical sim first, kind of see what's wrong, then proceed on to doing training sims that would, again, sort of educate people on whatever it is they want to improve, the new protocols, the new processes, whatever it might be. And then they would use exploratory sims sort of one-offs as necessary, not necessarily on a set timeline. So let's look at sort of the elements of the custom simulation design process. So traditionally, work starts with an insider at the client or organization that provides you with inside information, approves the sort of general narrative arc of the simulation that you're working on. This person tends to, because they have so much inside information on the sim and how it'll unfold, tends to be an observer on the day of. They're not really an active participant, since they, could skew the results by sort of helping people know what to do and what not to do. That person also helps you define the objective. What is it that you're trying to do with this sim? Are you trying to identify a point of failure? Are you trying to make a decision? What is it that you're trying to do here? And that helps you understand the elements that you need to include in the simulation, things that need to be tested, things that need to happen, things that should be avoided. That all goes into that process. You also define the participants. In these simulations, unlike in a lot of war games where you're assigned a role, right? I might be playing, pick a game, I'm blue or I'm red or I'm green. In these simulations, you are your own role. So you're not being asked to pretend to be something. You're not being asked to put yourself into another's perspective. It is your perspective. It is your job. It is your daily tasks. And that's what you'll be doing on the day of. So if you are the junior PR associate, you will be doing PR work. If you are the senior engineer, you'll be doing senior engineering work. And the simulations are designed to, as soon as we nail down the participants, have things for each person to do throughout the narrative. then there's, of course, logistics. So like I said, a lot of times these simulations tend to take place in a headquarters type location. Sometimes they might be at another location, making sure that you have the right space, the right tools, the right technology, enough chairs, enough breakout rooms, whatever it might be. You also establish special communications channels. In the simulations that I designed, we had people using their regular forms of communication. We just made dummy channels for them. There's a lot of discovery that happens, again, with the help of that inside person. You do a lot of research into past events that the company has had to contend with. You read up on their current manuals, their current plans, if that's what you're testing. You're trying to get a feel for their unique, qualities as an organization that you will be adding into the simulation to make it as realistic for them as possible. If a company does all of its communications in French, you're not going to be doing anything in Spanish. So again, trying to figure out what is going to make things the most realistic for the participants. And finally, you finalize the narrative, which becomes the simulation Bible. And I like to call it that because it's what we're asking people to believe, right? So the simulation Bible has all of the index, the pieces of information that move the simulation narrative forward. And it may be anything from fake news articles, fake news reels. They could be government documents demanding information. They could be readouts from systems suggesting that the system is being hacked or the system is experiencing a technical fault. They might be, depending on the situation, they might be weather system charts, they could be financial documents, and all of these are done to be as realistic as possible. And again, with the help of subject matter experts who can make them as realistic as possible. Afterwards, after you hold the simulation, you have an after action, or what some people call a hot wash or a debrief. And that's when you really get to dig into what people's perspectives are, what they liked and didn't like. And then you just out some lessons learned, and then comes the hard part, which is for the organization applying the lessons learned. And obviously implementation is always a challenge. But especially in situations like this, where you might uncover lots of different things and then have to have a plan for fixing them. So here's side quest slide number 3. If you've been paying attention so far, this might be easier. I know some of these are very strategically cut so that they don't reveal too much information about the board, but hopefully some of you will be able to get this one. Give you a few more seconds to review it. And on we go. So again, we talked about sort of the elements of the design process. So let's dig in a little bit more on some of these. So like I said, the main thing here is that you're trying to prepare for a potential crisis that might be coming. So for example, in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of companies that were gaming out what was going to happen if they had personnel in Ukraine or Russia, if they had personnel in surrounding countries, if they had certain interdependencies with vendors or partners in either country or in surrounding countries. So you would take a look at what you expect the situation to be. You would figure out where your concerns are, what could affect you, how the situation might unfold, what you would do for certain things that might happen throughout the situation, how you would meet the challenge. You would create the different injects once you've decided on what you think the event might unfold as. You would create the injects, you would iterate on them quite a few times. Iteration is very, very key. You would finalize all this work, you'd gather everybody together. Usually simulations last anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. There are some, that are on the shorter side if they tend to be more training geared, but in general terms, they're about 4 to 8 hours. You give people the inciting incident and you sort of watch the chaos unfold and smile deviously, and you hope that everyone will enjoy their experience. Now, for certain events that might be coming, think of a potential Taiwan crisis, think of, a potential way that the pandemic evolves into something more deadly. These are things that companies are now starting to realize they should be planning for ahead of time. In general, I won't say that this is for every situation, but in general, these simulations take about 6 months to design. So you need quite a bit of lead up time. You need everybody in place. You need everybody committed to the process. And so if you're thinking that something might happen in fall 2023, you should have already been planning, right? If we're thinking about a potential Taiwan crisis, there's, all kinds of different opinions, but people have thrown around end of 2024. Again, you might believe it, you might not believe it, but the preparation needs to be happening now if you're really looking to get ahead of a situation. Because not only do you need time to design the simulation, to run the simulation, to learn the lessons of it, you also need to implement the lessons learned. So if you think that you have certain interdependencies or certain dependencies that might be affected by a situation like a Taiwan crisis, you need to be doing things to find substitutions. You need workarounds. You need different ways of sourcing something or moving something. And so that takes a tremendous amount of time. And so while we can't, of course, predict the future, I think that it is extremely important for companies and organizations at large to be thinking about these types of events, because whether or not it goes slightly differently than you imagine or very differently than you imagine, having done that proactive thinking ahead of time, having really thought through what do you depend on, what do you need to operate, what is going to deal a death blow to your company and make it so that you can't continue operating at all anymore. These are things that you need to be focusing on ahead of time and that you can do something about in most cases. So that's sort of the broad strokes there of how that all happens. Like I said, once the simulation is over, you hold a debrief. When you do the debrief, it's very strategically done, right? In general, you have note takers in the room who have noted how the participants are engaging with the injects, how they're evaluating information, how they're deciding whether something is authentic or it's questionable, or someone's trying to pull the wool over their eyes, or someone's trying to manipulate them. And so you have a record of how all the different participants are interacting with information, how they're making decisions, what decisions they made, how that decision led to a new inject. In most cases, you will have had, during the design process, you would have, 4 or 5 different injects depending on what decision a team might have gone through, and then they would get the appropriate one, and then they would continue doing their work and seeing what comes next. So you will have probably 5 to 6 times more injects than you end up using, but you will have those in your back pocket if people do things that are somewhat unexpected, or if you're trying to test a particular thing, you can drive the narrative towards that particular conclusion, though I tend to believe that those are a bit more, a bit less useful. Those are a bit more manipulative of the narrative, and you really want to see how people are going to interact with something and not how they think they should be interacting with something, because that doesn't always give you a clear picture of how they would actually act in a crisis. During the debrief, you learn about what works and what doesn't work, right? In most cases, these sims are only held a few times, and so you don't have much room for improvement, but you can, of course, always learn something and make your next simulation even better. A lot of times, people will read things differently than you might have intended. A lot of times they might interpret them differently than you intended, but that is valuable insight in itself, for understanding how people are engaging with certain types of information. If you are leaving too much room for interpretation in your company communications, that leads your employees to do a lot of other things than the thing you intended, then the lesson learned is you should be much more clear in your communications, and there should be a single expectation of what people should be doing. And so all of that goes into the learning process for both the simulation team and the client. And then usually you'll have some skeptics in the room, people who are like, oh, why am I here? I don't do anything wrong. But they get caught up in the excitement of the simulation, the energy in the room, and usually they end up being happy they participated. And sometimes, in rare cases, but this does happen, they will thank you at the end, and they will apologize for being grumpy at the start. So it does change minds. People change through the experience. I myself have seen, the ways that participants go on to incorporate things they learn. Organizations go on to do mini sims as a way of making decisions. It's a really, awesome experience to see people change their minds, and to hopefully help them do their jobs better, easier, whatever it might be. As a result of your work. That's extremely gratifying. A lot of times in our work, we never really see the results. And so in this case, it's an important sort of validation mechanism when you do a good job. Again, applying the lessons learned is a very difficult part, and in most cases, the simulation design team is not involved in that. And that just makes it all the more important that all the after-action materials, all the documentation from the simulation really is created and finalized in a way that will make the company's job easier, to help them really understand what's been identified, to help them determine where they need to put their efforts and their investments going forward. And so the work does not end at the day of the simulation. The work continues past that. There are, of course, a lot of challenging parts to this. I don't want to give the impression that everybody sort of is super on board with this from the start. A lot of times the person who comes to you to help design a simulation is doing it because they've tried and failed to get leadership to buy into something, to understand the importance of something, to take action on something. And so your job is already harder because there is someone in the organization already resistant right off the bat to taking the time to do a simulation, let alone do the thing that you're trying to convince them is important. A lot of times, your job is to make the simulation as compelling as possible so people see the value, so people understand what you're trying to get across to them, and so that the person who contracts you for simulation is able to do what they need to do. A lot of times it is a situation where somebody within a company is sure that something is going to be a problem. Sometimes leadership doesn't agree, or sometimes leadership just has to be persuaded differently. And so that is part of the challenge, that you're not doing this just for funsies, you're really doing this to achieve something important. Time commitment. So like I said, these take sometimes months to design. They take 4 hours to 8 hours of participant involvement. That's usually a full work day. Sometimes you get people who say, oh, we can't afford to take a day off. This is not a day off. This is work. This is just doing your work a little bit differently for the day so that you can learn something as a result. So that tends to be a red flag for me if people are very resistant to investing the time, whether it's 4 hours, 2 hours, 8 hours, to putting in this important effort. Confidentiality is, of course, important, making sure that all the company information that you get as a simulation designer, if it is shared with you, is responsibly stored, is secured. Cybersecurity, which I work in, is obviously a major issue, and we need to make sure that everything that we're creating is safely stored and kept in a way that won't endanger company confidential information, won't result in competitors gaining advantage, etc. So it's a serious element of it. Participation, like I said, sometimes people are grouchy about participating, but then you also have another fear, which is people being afraid to make mistakes in front of their leadership. So when you come in and you say, we're doing this simulation to see how things are working or not working, you tend to scare people and they tend to wonder, oh no, what if someone from the C-suite is part of the simulation and I make a mistake? What if I get punished as a result? So usually you have a no-fault rule for simulations, and that just encourages people to be as candid as possible. And you really do want to see how they're going to react, right? This isn't a situation where you're in college and you just try to find out what the professor wants to hear for an A. We're really trying to get a sense of what people do, what people know, how people do it and know it and confirm it and evaluate it. So candidness and people's real reactions are really important as part of this process. So a no-fault rule really makes that easier. Obviously you'll have people who are skeptical to what extent the no-fault rule extends. You really just have to make a concerted effort to create a safe environment for everybody so that they can be authentic and candid. Lack of institutional memory is a challenge. So in the tech industry in particular, but in many industries now, there's lots of turnover. People tend to stay in their roles for only a couple of years. And when they leave, they take their institutional memory, their knowledge of how they do their job, what the company has gone through in their tenure there, they take that with them. And then you have a loss of this knowledge. And so oftentimes you'll see the same crisis happening because the person who managed it before left. And so people just did sort of their knee-jerk reactions, exacerbated the situation. Now you're in a crisis. And so if there's no mechanism for preserving that institutional knowledge, no matter how many of these simulations you do, if there's not a way to actually understand the lessons learned, preserve the lessons learned, preserve the actual institutional knowledge of the organization, they're going to have the same issues. So really encouraging people, oftentimes the result of the simulation is that you need a knowledge management system. You need a way so that if Bob, Henry, and Mary are leaders in a company and Henry leaves to go on paternity leave, people know how to continue operating, that his absence is not something that kneecaps the company. So it's important to have that sort of mechanism in place. And like I said, it turns out in a lot of simulations that there is a lack of it or an insufficiency in the organization's knowledge management system. And that's something that they need to work on to really improve and avoid making the same mistakes over and over. So let's move on here. This is side quest slide 4, if you're keeping track. I actually have no idea if this one is easy or difficult. I've played all of these games so many times, but for me, sometimes I'll see a photo of a board and I'll say, oh, I don't know what that is, but it turns out I played it years and years ago. But hopefully someone will hit all 5. I'll be very impressed if they do. All right, 3 more seconds. And moving on. So I have a series of book recommendations for those who might know a lot about war games, but also might be completely new to war games. A lot of war game books are written for the professional military education sector. There are comparably fewer war game books written towards like a private sector audience or a business audience. One of the ones that I found is Business War Games by Benjamin Gilad. Pretty good book, has some really good sort of exercises in it if you are tasked with creating these simulations for your organization. And also provides some background on sort of the evolution of how business war games even came to be a thing. So I would recommend that one. Thinking in Systems, Danella Meadows, much more of a sort of textbooky style feel. but again, valuable for people working within complex systems. I came from working in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where we were tasked with managing risk to very complicated systems. And so learning to think about how different systems interact, what they depend on, how they feed into each other is really valuable for helping to do simulations around companies or organizations that are within a complicated system or within a complicated, entangled network. And so that's a pretty good one too. Building blocks of tabletop game design, sort of the foundational tome. I think there's now an updated version, which I don't have, but some of my friends do. But the original will probably get you, 3/4 of the way there. When you're thinking about designing these types of simulations, you're usually not, throwing dice or using battle wheels, but understanding sort of the building blocks, the mechanisms of traditional tabletop game design, I think will help you to include elements of randomness and chance in your simulations, and help you sort of make some of those injects on the basis of random events or dice roll equivalents. So I think that's definitely a valuable one. War Games from Gladiators to Gigabytes, Martin Van Krevel, a great book, really a lot of the history of war games, everything from, like it says, gladiators all the way to present times, and how we use sort of computer simulations. He'll probably want to create, or someone will probably want to create an addendum to it involving artificial intelligence and chat GPT and all these other new developments and how they can be incorporated in. I'm really kind of curious to see what happens with that, actually. But I think my favorite book on this list is actually Imaginable by Jane McGonigal, out of the Institute for the Future in San Francisco. She is currently running I think it's a nationwide simulation that you can actually Google her name and it'll probably come up. I think it's called Urgent Optimists. And they're basically doing, like I said, a nationwide simulation where each week, you get prompts that you are responding to, and they're really trying to see how mass amounts of people react to certain things. But the book itself, Imaginable, is extremely valuable for sort of changing the way that you think about things. And it has a lot of really great practical exercises in it that will help you sort of envision different futures, think differently about the things you think challenge your assumptions, and get you to confront some of your biases when you say, oh, that's not possible, or that's definitely possible. So I think that's a really useful book. It's definitely not a traditional wargaming book by any means, but that's been the one that sort of made the biggest impression on me in the last year, I would say, of books that I've read. And then, so I know lots of people who are part of the society are interested in figuring out a way to do wargaming in their current roles or to get into the field. And for those people, I would say learn by doing, just start designing. Back when I was working other jobs, I was helping friends do things like prepare for first date, prepare for how to pitch a startup, prepare for how to secure funding from, a venture capital firm, rehearsing everything from, what happens if suddenly you lose your notes? What happens if it's a Zoom call, but your camera doesn't work? You can't share your screen. You're unable to use the different materials you've prepared. It really starts to get you thinking, gets the creative juices flowing, and you'll probably end up helping a friend prepare for something important. So like I said, just start designing. There's all kinds of things that you can do for practice, and it'll definitely help you sort of get in that mindset. Play games. The weirder, the more, the better. I've played everything from games where you're trying to get penguins across an ice field to super complicated things like Hannibal. My current egg I'm trying to crack is a game called Successors, which is actually by one of the same designers as Hannibal. It's an extremely complicated game, layers and layers of complexity about what happens in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death when his successors are vying for power. A huge map, tons of little, plastic figurines, little chits, all kinds of complicated battle mechanics. It's hard. It's hard learning all these things. It's hard getting good at them, but the more you play, the more familiar you get with mechanisms, the more familiar you get with how to stay true to a theme, how to make sure that your simulation is robust and considers a lot of different elements, is more comprehensive. There are lots of little things that you can learn just by playing games. And then you also just improve your analytical skills, which is really, really important. And then, of course, find ways to bring Sims to your job. So if you're having trouble convincing leadership about some investment that you want them to make, try to create a mini sim. It doesn't have to be 48 hours or 48 hours. It can just be an hour. It can be half an hour. But you can bring people together, give them a situation to contend with. You can do it as a tabletop exercises. Everybody's sitting in the same room. You don't have to spend months planning it. You can do it really quickly, and Imaginable and Business War Games and all the rest of those books will teach you how. And you can show rather than tell your superiors why what you think is true or correct. And, if you're tackling a really big challenge, you can bring in subject matter experts. You can host a workshop. You can get people really thinking about different possible future scenarios, how you would respond to something, how you could shape a situation that you're trying to shape. Bringing SMEs together into the room is a tremendously useful way to sort of get the process rolling on getting to having simulations be a part of your way of making decisions. And finally, of course, strengthen your network. The society is great, but find people who are in roles that you would love to have one day. Talk to them, build relationships with them, find ways to collaborate with them, or to write an article with them. There's lots of ways to sort of get in front of the people who are doing what you want to be doing, and to learn from them, from their mistakes, from what they've done well, get their advice. And for the most part, people are really happy to help people get into this field. This is a growing field. This is an evolving field. It needs diversity. It needs lots more people with very creative ways of thinking to really get it to where it needs to be. So, I would urge you to do your best to find ways to integrate wargaming and simulation design into your everyday if this is something that interests you. And as always, I am happy to be a resource. You're free to email me and ask me questions. I do this all the time. I'm, I think, third-year Georgetown mentor, so please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help. And one last side quest slide here. This is number 5. So once you identify this one, you can press send, and I will definitely respond and let you know if you are right with all 5 of these. I'm really curious to see who gets all 5. I might have made this too difficult, but we'll see. We'll see. All right, 2, 1. All right. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. I'm happy to take any questions you have. And if you're shy and you don't want to do it on Zoom, send me an email. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, so I got a couple questions directly messaged to me. I'll see if anyone else wants to drop any questions. But one of the first questions asked, what is your approach when designing simulations that are different from, let's say, commercial game design?
Well, so all of these simulations are really different from commercial game design. I mean, they are all highly customized. They are really driven by the needs of the specific organization that is requesting them. So like I said, you don't create a game board. You have this, binder of injects instead. You have this inciting incident. And then based on how the participants in the room respond to the inciting incident, you start feeding them injects, commensurate with their decisions or what they are struggling with. Whatever you're testing for. So it's really highly customized each time. I've never rerun the same simulation. And in most cases, in fact, the simulations, if they involve any kind of company confidential material, cannot be rerun because they are confidential to that company. So each time is different. There are, once you do this often enough, you sort of have, a framework of 10 to 12 sort of traditional inciting incidents, depending on what sector you're working with or what type of event they're concerned about. And so you have a traditional starting point, but all of the injects themselves will be customized. So if it's a tech company, they will be heavily on hardware, software issues. If it's a financial company, it will be a lot of financial materials. It will involve either a ransomware incident or some sort of other cyber attack. It will traditionally have some sort of component where employees are out of pocket or not reachable or can't be tracked in the aftermath of a certain event to help test those kinds of abilities. So it's really, really highly customized. And you're really looking to that inside person who's working with you to really make sure it has all of the elements that you needed to include to meet the objective. Sometimes, like I said, the objective might be to test a business continuity or resilience plan. So these plans that companies have, if, I don't know, if the power goes out, how do we continue working? If, there's a natural disaster that keeps us from being able to transport our goods, what do we do? And so you're really designing that around a scenario where a company would be unable to continue normal operations, but it is, again, highly customized to that specific company, their specific needs, their specific way of working, what they do to make money, what their geographic footprint looks like. So every time it's driven by that objective.
So another question is asked, you mentioned systems thinking and complexity. Do you have any favorite methods or approaches for mapping system dynamics in a new domain that lend themselves well to the translation into game mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've sort of come to any one conclusion on this. Sometimes the clients provide materials that can sort of help you break down what their system looks like and where their system exists within, sort of the greater operating environment. Sometimes they don't. One thing that CISA was trying to do in particular was decompose the national critical functions, water, electricity, transport, internet connectivity, trying to understand sort of how do all these systems work? What do they rely on to work? What could disrupt them? How could we fix a disruption? How could we work around a disruption? And so that sort of decomposition work is one way to do it. So really breaking down each piece into a smaller piece until you get to the smallest nut and bolts that a system is reliant on. And so working backward. But that part is really difficult. And so you have to, at some level, admit that you can't do everything in one go, and sort of acknowledge your scope or acknowledge the limitations within the simulation environment. There's a terrific new industry that's popped up called digital twins. And these companies that create digital twins, they basically clone your company in a digital realm. I think BMW is building a plant this way. They've created a digital plant And so they're trying to figure out what they can optimize or what they can change or improve in the sort of digital realm, where the digital twin is literally down to where the light switches are, where, you know, the pathways are, how wide the pathways are, really down to that level of granularity, and working from that. And trying to simulate things in that digital domain to make the real physical factory much better, more effective, more sustainable, more efficient, whatever it might be. And so if you're looking in that sort of space, using a digital twin and integrating that into an interactive simulation might be a good way to do it. Obviously expensive, obviously time consuming, but depending on what sector you're in, depending on the projected losses, if you don't do it, it might make sense. So that's something to look into, and will probably be used more in the future, honestly, as computing power increases and we're able to do that kind of thing, to really simulate at every layer of detail. So I'm really excited about that, and the potential for how that unfolds and helps people make better decisions.
So what is an experience where you struggled or you had issues designing a game?
I would say each one has its own struggles. But I think for me, sometimes the problem is that there are not enough people in the room. Like I said, a lot of, you know, organizations might think that this is a cumbersome endeavor, that this takes a lot of time and energy, and so they're unwilling to let, you know, more than 20 people be in the simulation. So not really getting the benefit of, you know, I might get one senior engineer, but I'd really love to have like a junior engineer. I'd like the perspective of someone who hasn't been in the job for long, someone who is new to the field, because they have oftentimes a much different perspective. And so not having enough people as part of it is one challenge. Another challenge, I think, is people tend to fall into sort of linear thinking. They tend to think that something will continue forever. And so challenging their biases, challenging their assumptions is often sort of a delicate process where you really have to do your best to persuade them that, you know, I understand that you might personally think that things might go this way, but let's consider some alternatives. And so a lot of it is sort of, there's a psychology element here. So understanding who you're working with and how they best consume information and how they can be persuaded. And so that's definitely a challenge, you know, for personalities and different people and different, some people have had, this is another one, some people have had really bad simulation experiences in the past. You know, they've been in a simulation that they really didn't enjoy. Maybe it wasn't very well done. Maybe it was too complicated. Maybe it didn't suit the right needs. And so they sort of have a bad taste in their mouth from their last experience. And so overcoming that, getting them to buy into this again, to give it another shot, is a challenge that oftentimes comes up. And like I said, you know, not everybody in the room will come away with the same experience, but you want to have, you know, done your job and changed a few minds and really provided some valuable feedback for your client, and given them the tools to make improvements. And so you're not going to win over everybody. You will also have to set reasonable objectives for yourself and what success looks like for you as the designer. Because I think that otherwise you're going to be disappointed. It's not a popularity contest. You're really there to do a job. And so I think that's another challenge that definitely has to be overcome sometimes.
So for those who had bad experiences with simulations, as you mentioned, what would you say to convince them to give them another chance, or tell them why they had bad experiences?
Sure. Sometimes it's a matter of listening to them, right? It's getting their perspective on why they had such a bad experience. Instead of saying, oh, you know, it was probably just a bad simulation, let's talk about why. What went wrong? What can you identify that was really disagreeable to you? But in other ways, I'd say, like, have you been on a bad date? Yes. Did you keep dating? Probably. So gotta give it another shot. This one might be better. Hopefully it will be better, and you will do your hardest as the designer to make it better. But really getting a feel for who will be in the room and whether or not they're receptive to this method, this medium of learning something and trying something is definitely important. Oftentimes you will only get to meet the participants the day of. You won't spend any time with them ahead of time, but your inside person will usually be able to tell you if, the entire engineering department really hates simulations, or the entire PR department thinks it's a waste of time. And so that kind of insight will be valuable. And you can sort of tailor your persuasive remarks accordingly.
So participant asks, what are some good ways that a player can be a good player in these kind of simulations? What tips would you tell them if they're attending one of these for the first time and they want to be a good player?
Great question. I think, again, the most important thing here is to be candid in your reactions, to be authentic. If you have questions, to ask them, to really engage with the material, to not fight the narrative. I think a lot of times you get people who want to fight the narrative. They say, oh, that wouldn't happen. Oh, it wouldn't be like this. Well, let's imagine that it is like this. Like I said, I call it the simulation Bible because it's what I'm asking you to believe. And if you're able to believe it and you're able to, get that starting point down, you can be a really good participant. It's just like going to see a movie, right? We're asking you to suspend your disbelief that, people can teleport in and out of thin air and all of that. I know for some people it's immensely difficult to suspend their disbelief. And they are realists through and through. But I think the number one thing is you're being asked to believe something, believe it, go from that starting point. And again, be an active participant. Don't just sit there and stew. If you disagree with something, bring it up. If you think that something's wrong or you think that something can be changed, bring it up. Again, you're there to engage with the narrative, and engagement requires active participation. It's not sitting back and being quiet. So those two, I think, are the main two pieces of advice for being a really good player.
So as I wait for some last minute questions, I always ask a similar question to everyone, which is, what is a game that or a book, film, whatever, that has inspired you in your game design recently?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question. Besides that book Imaginable, which I mentioned, so I think an interesting sort of series of movies have been all the multiverse movies, just to get you to kind of think about how things could look differently in different universes. I think that's a valuable way to be creative. I think in some ways, like the Doctor Strange movie, if anyone saw the new one, there were these different worlds where, like, I think pizza was cubes or something. And I was like, that's literally the only thing that's different about this universe. You want some more creativity. You want to think about things that could be really different. And I think in a lot of ways, our current world, our one and single universe that we inhabit is extremely diverse, and we are not yet doing enough to sort of integrate all the different components of our diversity into the games we design. I've been really happy to see you, Sebastian, know, but for those who don't, I'm a big fan of Labyrinth, the game and puzzle store on Capitol Hill, Eastern Market. They have had an explosion of interest from women in wargaming. There have been tremendous strides in integrating women designers into war games. Tori Brown's game Votes for Women has been a bestseller there. And so I think what affects my design and my thinking is a lot of times like getting to talk to people who are new to wargaming, who have never done this before, never played these games before, and the perspectives that they bring, because they tend to see things, you sit down at a board game and you're like, oh, I kind of already get the picture, but seeing it through someone else's eyes, seeing it fresh through their perspective, I think is really useful for helping understand how things come across. and the extent to which you sort of get into this vocabulary of games that is very foreign to other people. I mean, it's really like a different language that you're speaking. And so kind of interacting with different people and seeing that and getting to see it through their eyes, I think is immensely valuable to me as a designer.
All right, so I have a last minute question that came in,
Sure.
which is unsurprising given the rise of ChatGPT, but is how do you see AI like ChatGPT affecting your work and other game design?
Sure. I think there are some really cool applications. I think there are ways to sort of get the AI to do some of the sort of busy work parts of this, creating, 5 different versions of a news article, or massaging the text on something so it reads one way or the other. Because a lot of times when you're doing like these fake news articles or these fake news reels, you're like racking your brain, like, how can I do this differently? How can I have a couple of different versions of this? And so having, ChatGPT make it a little bit easier, save me some time, is great. On the other hand, I think there's a sort of implicit bias within, implicit and explicit, I guess, but implicit in the sense that we don't always acknowledge that things like AI are trying to find sort of the most efficient answer. But in a lot of these cases, we're not trying to find the most efficient route from point A to point B. We're trying to do something much more complex and much more nuanced. And sometimes efficiency defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. I mean, if we're talking about efficiency, you could just design all games on like a black and white board with black and white wood cubes and stuff like that. But we're trying to design interesting things, diverse things, colorful things. And so a lot of that is sort of lost when the main prime directive is just to be the most efficient. So I think there's definitely some opportunities there, but I think we're going to have to acknowledge the limitations. We're going to have to obviously fact check, because there have been some very egregious errors, that are coming out of some of these questions that are asked of ChatGPT and the like. And we have to be, questioning whether the AI sort of understands what we're trying to accomplish when we're doing some of these things. So definitely curious how it plays out. Somewhat worried. I'd say probably 60-40 curious, excited, 40 kind of worry and worried about how it might affect the field. But I don't think it's going to put a lot of simulation designers out of work for a long time.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your Tuesday evening with us. I know that is really generous of you, and to share your expertise and your experiences. And I know I learned a lot, so I appreciate that. And I will look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. This is terrific, and I'm glad somebody learned something. And I will be in touch for anybody who entered the side quest.